Brownbird here with another video. Before I begin, like and subscribe. Thank you. So today's video was going to be about a heatedly debated topic about the sensitivity about the N-word used amongst so-called black people versus when so-called white people use it. And in this clip that you're going to view, this is an argument between a so-called black student and a so-called white teacher. Especially the so-called white teacher is actually teaching about history. Now, this is my thing. You can come from certain environments where you're not exposed to the quote-unquote urban culture. You're not exposed to hip-hop. You're not exposed to anything that is relative to so-called black people or the North American Negro or people of the Afro diaspora. My views on the N-word, which I'll probably make a comment again later in this video, has a different meaning from what people think it is. Now, of course, when it comes to the N-word, this is a word that is used usually as a colloquial towards so-called black people amongst so-called black people and people of the Afro diaspora. Now, with this being said, it is always a sensitive topic of conversation when a so-called white person dares to step on the boundaries and the toes of a so-called black person, more so a so-called black man, when they decide to use the N-word. With this video that's going to play, I'm going to give my commentary on it while it plays. So peep.
Racist as shit. How you just so little white that you can't understand that nigga is racist for a white man to say to a black man? That's fucking racist. Ian, would you say nigga? Would you ever say nigga? No. Corporate would never say nigga. Would you say nigga? Would your white people say nigga? Fuck no, they wouldn't say nigga. How they?
Listen, I wouldn't be surprised if them people don't use the N-word in the classrooms, but when they around their friends, they probably use the N-word and probably put it up on TikTok. You never know.
Well, you know what a commoditized word means? Explain this to me. That's a word that's used so many times that it doesn't mean its original. It's used by black people. It's used by everyone. No, you use it. Don't say everyone. The word has become.
Let me make my commentary on that. Now, I understand where the so-called white man is coming from. My opinion on it is that, yes, nowadays the N-word has been not ostracized, but it's now been used to a point where everybody uses regardless of any nation. Now, this is the thing where I have to hold the fire to the so-called black students' feet. My thing is, who's responsible for the word getting out there and letting all these other nations use it? Now, we could say that the music industry is responsible for it, that various of so-called black artists are using the N-word every day, and that the industry is responsible for the degradation of the common so-called black man. Yeah, we can go off of that if you want to, but we also have to hold the responsibility and accountability to the everyday so-called black folks that think it's okay to use the N-word amongst other nations, especially towards the so-called white man. The thing about it is this. Who is directly responsible has to deal with the environment. I can't fault a so-called white man, a so-called Asian man, a so-called Latino, a so-called whatever nation that is mentioned, or any nation that is to be represented, for being raised in a certain environment where they're used to being called the N-word by so-called black people, whether it be a serious argument or whether it be a playful term that they want to use in order to make it sure that they are friends. In order to respect the responsibility for the word getting out to other nations, you have to also think about it on an individual point. If you are a so-called black person that holds the boundary to say to a so-called white person, do not call me the N-word, you should expect not to say that N-word to the same so-called white person in other environments. You are ultimately responsible for the idea of saying the N-word to certain nations if you are that person that says the N-word to other nations.
Has become commoditized so that anyone can use it, and it's not a negative connotation. It's a negative ass connotation. It's a negative ass connotation. For you to say it to me is negative. Okay, when you hear it in a bunch of songs, are those people being negative when they use it? By black men. By just black men. By black men. What does the word mean when they use it? My friend, by black men. White men don't say that shit. Eminem, who's a fucking rapper, he would never say it in a fucking song. It's official. And he said, if you say a word, it means friend.
And let me say something to that, because this is the conversation that usually gets into this. The psychosis of the so-called black man, in order to make his situation relative to the point that there is a restriction on the so-called white man, especially when it comes to the hip-hop culture. They will always use a popular so-called white rapper in order to validate their opinion, such as which a lot of people call the GOAT of hip-hop, Eminem, Marshall Mathers. And with that being said, a lot of people don't even realize someone like Eminem did use the N-word in his earliest raps, and he did say something against so-called black women, especially when he got aired out by Nick Cannon from a song he did in '96. In order to validate the so-called white man's opinions, when he says those different things, of course he's going to go on an angle of saying that it's different when he uses the context of word versus when a so-called black boy uses the context of the word.
Friend, and if I say a word, the same word, it means something different. Yeah, that's not true. Just the fuck. It's not true. It's not. It's not if you want the world to move on. If you want the world to be the way it was 50 years ago, then you're true. The more you're moving on, because white people aren't saying nigga. If a white man says nigga, it's just not moving on. You say nigga, it's slavery. Nigger, I'm a fucking nigger. I'm a fucking nigger. You put me in.
The thing about it again, people, is the fact of the matter is it's due to an environment. You are ultimately responsible for what you allow and what you don't allow. The thing about it is there are a lot of so-called white men who use the N-word without any problems and without any judgment. And I won't loosely blame them because, yes, some of them do use it in a racial term. Some of them use it because they think they are validated by the opinion of so-called black people, because there are so-called black people that call them the N-word as a way to relate to them and get along with them.
Nobody uses that word. Yes, they do. Nobody says nigger. You acting like
that white boy, that white teacher know damn well that people use the N-word with an ER. Stop playing.
We're having a conversation, you can say the word, but I can't. You can't say nigger or fucking nigger. Calling somebody the orders of my fucking race from our fucking teacher. Don't say that shit. I'm not calling you.
And let me say, since this is a history teacher, what needs to be understood with his ignorance is that he needs to learn what is the etymology of what the N-word is. Now, the thing about it is the so-called white teacher may think it's very harmless, and some people might say this is tone-deaf racism. Whatever your opinions on that is your opinions, but this is why I'm going to recommend you guys watch my latest video called Vet Thy Children, Teach Your Child the Real N-word. Why I break down what the N-word means. Because if you understand the actual context of what the word means, N-word is nothing more but a description to describe especially North American Negroes as black. When you break down the idea of what the word Negro and what the N-word means.
Calling you anything. I don't give a fuck. No one's calling anything. You said it. You said it. Dude, if we're in a class and I'm teaching you, hey, the word nigger is an old... We're in a class and I'm teaching you, hey, the word nigger is an old... Dude, please, it's a word, bro. You cannot go through life and act like a word. Stop fucking saying that shit. Can affect. Stop saying nigger and nigger. Point blank fucking period. You keep saying it. I can say it. I said it one time. You missed your conversation. This conversation. We had a whole assembly. We're assembly after school. We're assembly after school. 25 times. I can say it. I'm black.
And I just noticed that the brother was wearing a dashiki. I just noticed that. But let me say something to this. The whole entire sensitivity about saying the N-word, especially when it comes to different nationalities of people, is dependent on the environment and depending on how you take it. My thing about it is, would I get offended if a so-called white man calls me the N-word? It depends on what the term he's using it as. Is he using it as a racist term? Then of course I'm going to get offended. If he tries to use that as a way to relating to me, I will politely tell him, please do not use that word when referring to me. And I understand that there's a paradox or there's a contradiction when it comes to using that word amongst people, because so-called black people use the N-word as a reference to call someone a friend or a buddy. When we have a so-called white person that uses the N-word, regardless if they're not coming across as offensive to the common so-called black person's psyche, they won't forgive the so-called white person for the idea of slavery, thus still thinking that the N-word, when they use it, is applied to thinking that they are trying to say they are their slave masters. And with that being said, honestly, I understand that usually when it comes to these inner city schools, not to sit up there and say that this classroom is within a school within an inner city place, that so-called white teachers may always try to reach for the boundary when it comes to sensitive topic of conversation such as this. To them, they may not think that they're doing any harm by using the word, but they have to understand the sensitivity of the racial slur that is only applied to so-called black people. My thing about it is, if there was any other nationality that was in that school and it was about a racial slur that was being used, I'm guaranteeing you that probably more than likely that so-called white person wouldn't even think about using that racial slur. But for whatever reason, there was a smokescreen when using the N-word amongst so-called black people in present. My thing about it is this: for a conflict resolution, because I understand so-called white people usually are the first to go into these inner city schools or go into these schools where there's a mass amount of so-called black people as a population, or will go into these schools where there is a diversity. But when it's talking about Black History Month, or it's talking about the clever things when it comes to so-called black people, I would advise so-called black people, so-called white people, just do not use the word. Just say the N-word, or spell it out. Do not use the N-word. Yes, it does trigger certain so-called black people, even if they are ignorant themselves, when it comes to using the N-word around their friends. It is all about the idea of culture. But when I talk about culture, what I'm merely saying is so-called black people do not have a culture. What they try to do is retain different phrases, different things that they think is culture, certain things that are food or things that is related to what they had to go through, aka through the idea of oppression, in order to give it a positive remix and a positive spin in order to say that is culture. And especially nowadays when you have certain people who uphold the idea of challenges or uphold the idea of twerking being a part of so-called black culture. It's a lot of mess if you ask me, but if you understand exactly what's going on, it is the idea of boundaries, a smokescreen between the so-called white person and so-called black person. And again, I would advise, on the so-called black person's side, you have to be very aware of the words you use towards the so-called white person if you care enough about the meaning of the word and where it originates from. So-called white people, you have to not just use the word if you know it's going to come forward with an uproar and ruckus. Because so-called black people have no problem calling out so-called white people for using the N-word when they feel like it. And especially in history class, when it's taught by a so-called white teacher, and when you find that a good amount of so-called white people will go to these Ivy League schools and these 4-degree or whatever it is, top colleges, they do study upon quote unquote African history, so-called African American history, and then they will regurgitate the information they learned from that school, because it's usually allowed to go into these colleges, universities, or public school systems to go ahead and teach it, and think that by sitting up there saying that we're all cool, I am allowed to use the word however I see fit. Otherwise than that, please stay tuned for more of my videos. Like and subscribe. Peace.